Hey y'all, welcome to day 22 of my 30-day reflection series. My name is Shawn Aaron, he, him, his, and thank you to folks for tuning in today. As promised from yesterday, yesterday was kind of an impromptu reflection. And so today, as promised, I'm going back to what I originally wanted to talk about yesterday. I'm talking about it today. And so today I'm talking about transitioning later in life. And so today's question is, what did you take away from E.L. Winston's story? And so this question is in reflection to Dem Boys Podcast, episode 78. And so for folks who know, I am the host of Dem Boys Podcast. And so Dem Boys Podcast works to amplify the voices of trans men of color as we share our transition stories and journeys, right? And so it's to give voice to black trans men, to trans men of color in general, right? Because we also always left out of the narrative of trans folks and trans journeys. And so I started Them Boys Podcast in order to give us a platform to create ancestral presence and for our stories to live, right? So folks to know in the future when they're archiving trans men of color's lives, we will be a resource for people to tap into to hear about how folks were living in 2025, 2024, 2023, right? Depending on how far off in the future, right? You have to go back into the past. So anyway, the episode with E.L. Winston on Them Boys Podcast is episode 78, titled How to Put Help and Hope into Action. So I want to plug in a couple of minutes here of E.L. talking about their transition and transitioning later in life. And this question was posed because I have a similar journey. I began my medical transition in my early 30s. And so I guess to some folks, that's later in life. But to me, it's later in life because I had already went through a whole bunch of stuff. And so I'm going to play it a couple of minutes and then I'm going to come back and tell you why I chose to talk about this, to reflect on this particular episode and how EL talked about within this episode about being dismissed with its transition journey in the beginning, right? And so just listen, and then I'll come back and talk about and reflect on it. Love that, like that's beautiful. And so what I do know about you from our previous episodes, knowing that you began your medical transition later in life, and so I consider you an
Mhm.
elder, and not because of your transition history of like when you transition, right? People think elder is like, oh, I transitioned 30 years ago. No, I consider you my elder because of years and wisdom and experience, right? And so, how was
Right.
that for you transitioning later in life?
Man, it was scary. It was it was scary. It was frustrating at times. Until I found my tribe per se. Um for me, transition looked different and I felt like a lot of what I call the old guard were very dismissive of right. They were very dismissive of my journey in the beginning, right? Because so like I said, I chose not to change my name. And so some people had an issue with that. Um I could not medically transition at the time because of other medical issues I had going on. So there was an issue with that. Um and so for me, like I try to explain to people like everybody's journey is different. And so um when I explained why um at the time I had decided not to um medically transition, I got a lot of pushback because, you know, people felt like that was the next part of my evolution or should have been the next part of my evolution and it wasn't, and I was good with that. Like I often try to explain to people like because I'm not knocking however you get through the journey, that's how you get through the journey, but you don't have the right to tell someone else that their road to the journey is not what it is, or that you don't you don't qualify to be in the club. You know what I'm saying? Like,
So that was just a piece of EL's episode. So if you want to hear the episode in its entirety, be sure to tap into Dem Boys Podcast. It's on all listening platforms. You can listen to it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can listen to it also directly from the website. So our website is demboys.org. That's DEMBOIS.org. And you can also listen to it on iHeartRadio. And so I love how, first of all, I love when EL said the old guard, and it reminds me of that movie that's out right now with Charlize Theron, Old Guard. Anyway, I digress. So, first of all, I want to say, listen, everybody's trans journey is different. We do not get there should not be any gatekeepers to trans identity, trans experience, trans the process, right? We're not monolithic, and I say that all the time. Like, we're not monolithic, and everybody's journey does not start and end the same. And so folks were dismissive of EL and his journey. And so for me, I also transitioned later in life. I transitioned in my early 30s, and my transition went according to my life, right? According to how I felt internally about myself, and then how I wanted to represent myself with the world and with my gender identity. And everybody has their reasoning and their timeline in life, right? And so I hate how people give this that age has a destination for goals, right? You like, oh, you 35, you still live with your mother. Like, what's wrong with that? Right? Being 35 does not equal that you don't live with your mother, right? Being 35 does not mean that you have life figured out yet. Being 35 does not mean that you have your transition, your gender identity, or any of these things figured out, right? Some people don't find love into their later in life, right? And so for me personally, I did not have the language, I didn't have the experience, and I didn't have the exposure to what I could or what I wanted to identify with, right? And so also I experienced a lot of life. I experienced a lot of life. And so I was in survival mode. And so I had no way of pinpointing my identity until I later came out of survival mode, and then I started to hit that peak of being in thriving in my thriving phase. But I will say this, and I've said this before, I've gone through all of the letters, the LGBTQ, right? And in every step, I was happy where I was. It wasn't like, oh, a lot of some trans folks and some not, but a lot of trans folks say, oh, when I was younger, I just knew something was different, right? I knew something was different about me. I knew that I was always a masculine presenting younger child, but I didn't equate that to wanting to be a man per se. That came later in life. That came later after therapy. That came later after reflections. That came later after experiences. That came later after certain exposures in life. And so EL talked about in the episode about people being dismissive. And I also had an experience with someone being dismissive. And so my partner at the time, my wife at the time, introduced me to someone that she knew that was trans mask identifies, and he was much older than me. And so right now at this recording, I'm 44, and and I start transitioning probably 33, 34 years old. He was already 10, 15, 20 years my senior. And so he could, at that time, technically was considered my elder. And he had transitioned many, many years ago. And so, but in this episode with EL also said that, just because I consider EL my elder, not because he transitioned 20, 30 years ago, but because of his age in comparison to my age. So he has been through a lot more stuff, has a lot more life experiences, etc. So anyway, my wife at the time introduced me to him and said, because she was very supportive in my journey, and she said, maybe you should talk to somebody who has experience with transitioning. And so I want to note that at this time, I didn't even know that I wanted to start T. And I said that T was HRT, testosterone, hormone replacement therapy was not going to be a part of my process. The only thing I knew, and I knew this since I hit puberty, was I wanted to have my chest gone. I mean, gone. If I had to unravel them and lay them out on the table and chop them off myself, that was going to happen. But I wanted them gone. I wanted them gone since the first day they started to poke out. I hated them. And anyway, so I knew I didn't want testosterone. I hadn't decided or didn't know about a name change because I had no idea what I wanted to change my name to. I was already going by Shawn, which is a derivative of my middle birth name. So I met this guy. We were at a public event, and so she was familiar with his wife at the time, and so she had already made the connection of, hey, I want Shawn to meet him. And so we were at this public event. And so, we met up with them. And so he, when he first looked at me, he just did a little up and down scan of me and automatically had dismissed me based on what I look like. And so he kind of pulled me to the side and was like, oh, yeah, I heard you want to transition. I was like, yeah, I want to transition, identify as a trans man, but I don't want to start T. I just want top surgery. And so the first thing after that came out of his mouth was, then how are you identifying as trans and you don't want to start T? You need to do that first before you even think about top surgery. And he turned back around and was done talking to me and went on about his day. And my wife at the time and his wife was still conversating. And I just was so sad. Like, I literally was depleted just in that little couple of minutes of interaction. And so, mind you, also I was very vulnerable because I come from a history of verbal abuse. So I was triggered in that moment of I was just being dismissed, somebody talking to me crazy or just not valuing me and who I was standing in front of them. And so I just cowered down like a little kitten. Like I was so shy. I was so sad. And I waited for my wife to finish her conversation. And he just was gone. He turned around. He didn't even wait for his own wife. He just turned around and kept going. Like I meant nothing to him. And it hurt me. It broke me down and it hurt my feelings. And I know who he is to this very day. Oddly enough, right? For folks who don't know, this is your first day with me. Thank you for joining me and welcome. I'm also the founder of Dem Bois Inc. And Dem Bois provides financial assistance for trans men of color to obtain gender affirming surgery. We're all about trans men of color care and visibility. So he actually reached out to me via email. I don't even think he know who I was. I don't even think he knows who I am, if he ever had contact with me or whatever. But one thing that my mother taught me of all the things is be careful how you treat people because you never know who they are going to be. And she's always taught me that since I was a child. And so I hold that. That's one of the valuable lessons that she taught me outside of all the other harm that was caused. There were some few nuggets that my mom left with me, and that was one of them. Or she would always say, like, be careful how you treat people because that person may be the one who need to save your life. And she used to say that in regards to racism, right? But she would say, white people should be careful how they treat people because a black person might need to save their life. Anyway, but that's still a valuable lesson that I learned. And so even to this day, I'm very careful how I treat people, even if I do not like you. Unless you do something very harmful to me, then I will make it very clear that I don't like you and to please leave me alone or get out of my space. But on a first time interaction, I treat people with the utmost respect, no matter who you are. You don't even have to be trans identified. I treat people with respect because that is how I would want someone to treat me. And so I don't treat people how I want to be treated. I treat people how they want to be treated. And nobody wants to be dismissed. Nobody wants to be shooed away or just people just don't want that. Right. And so I make sure if I see someone, if someone wants to speak to me, especially now. Right. And so I'm in a different place in my life. And so I'm here. You can see me here. So if you see me somewhere and you want to talk, unless I'm super busy, but I would do it in a very gentle way, right? I appreciate you. You know, I mean, like there is a way to communicate with people in a healthy way, right? So people can feel seen, can feel heard and affirmed. And so it just broke me, right? And so I went on this thing of, and thank goodness I had a therapist at the time. So I was able to unpack that in therapy, and my therapist helped me work through those feelings and to say that that's not mine. Those feelings and the way that he made me feel, those weren't my feelings, those were his, and I needed to shake that and leave that behind because that wasn't a part of who I was internally and who I was trying to work on to become. And so that's his own deflection of who he is and who he think that he is, right? And so he's got that gatekeeping, like I'm gatekeeping trans identity and you don't fit in this description, so I'm closing the gate. You can't come into the gate, right? And so that's the same type of thing that EL was talking about, like how people dismissed him of his journey, and for whatever reason, and because of health reasons, he couldn't start T, right? And so it's like you got to think about all of these things. And some people just don't want that. All of our journeys don't look the same. All of us don't want the same results. All of, even for folks that like me, I want to transition, but I want to microdose. So they don't want all their changes all at once. They want them to come very slowly, right? There are folks right now that I know that I've had conversations with that have severe health issues and they wish that they can transition, but it's just not physically or medically possible. And that does not take away their trans identity. So I want folks to know that if you are watching me and you identify as trans, there's no prerequisite. This isn't college. You don't have to take 101 to get to 201. That's not how this works. If you internally know who you are, that's all it takes. That's all it's about. Right. And so I'm glad I didn't listen to him. I'm glad that I had a guide, I had a therapist, and I'm glad that I was strong enough to say, yo, what you saying, that ain't right. I did it when I was younger, when my mom would tell me stuff that I knew that wasn't right. And I had enough guts in me to know as an adult that that wasn't right and that I didn't deserve. I didn't know it in that moment, but I later realized that I did not deserve to be treated that way. And so what I took away from EL's story was no matter what someone else says to you about you, you have to figure out within yourself what's in you. And if it means transitioning later in life, right? And also people transition later in life due to safety, due to security, due to family structure. It's a large amount of reasons due to self awareness. Like there's so many different nuances, around someone's trans identity. Everyone doesn't have the privilege to have parents to let them to express themselves at 5 years old, right? Like it's like so many different ways and so many different dynamics when it comes to trans identity that it's not one linear way to get to the end, right? And so we all have our own ways and our own journeys to carry. We have our own loads to carry. We have our own journeys to take. And so I'm not the gatekeeper. I'm not here to tell you what is good for you and what's not good for you, but I am here to say that I see you, I support you, and I affirm you in your identity, right? And so once again, this is day 22 of my 30-day engagement. Listen, we almost done, y'all. We got 8 more days to go. So I want to thank you for rocking with me for 22 days. That is a long time to be looking at me, right? Every day you got to look at me. And if you haven't looked at me every day, you need to go back and look at me some of them days that you missed. Anyway, if you enjoy this content, if you enjoy some of the topics and some of the videos that I've been posting here, please comment below. And so I would love to know. Let me look at my notes because if y'all know me, I got notes, right? And so I want to know, if you haven't listened to this episode, be sure to go and check it out. But if you have, drop in the comments below. What are your comments about it? What do you take away from EL's story, right? And if you have begin your transition later in life, I would love to hear from you as well. Drop in the comments. What was your reasoning for transition later in life? If you want to share, feel free. Do you feel that journey was at the right time, or do you wish that you was able to do it earlier? But anyway, please engage with the content. If you love this video, if you love this topic, be sure to share it with folks in your network so other folks can hear this conversation and to know that there are people that transition later in life and that they are not alone. So, once again, my name is Shawn Aaron, he, him, his. Today has been day 22. Come back tomorrow and see me for day 23. Take care.